Off you go.
Okay, thank you very much, Todd. If you wouldn't mind at the end of the presentation, if you wouldn't mind reading the chat so we can address questions at the
I can
end.
help with that. Yep.
And I also want to thank my colleague, Michelle Cook, who will be navigating the PowerPoint. So thank you, Michelle. Any screw ups in that are my fault, not Michelle's. Anyway, I also want to thank David for establishing such a terrific foundation on disability awareness and, in particular, civil rights laws and legislation and regulations, because I'm going to pick it up where he left off. When we talk, we've addressed this title as the accessibility to historic sites, the decision process. And the decision process starts by focus on the purpose or the intended use of an historic site or property. I'm going to talk about a lot of the different opportunities, uses, and benefits of the historic structures themselves. I'm going to start with Independence Hall. The assembly room of Independence Hall, and Independence Hall was originally built to be the Pennsylvania State House. It's where this particular room is where the Pennsylvania Assembly met. And they provided the Continental Congress the use of that particular room, the Second Continental Congress, the use of that particular room. And it was during that Second Continental Congress that the suggestion or the recommendation that we break away from England and start our own country. And that's exactly where it was established. In that room, 11 years later, the Constitutional Convention also met, and they wrote and passed the Constitution that we have today. So therefore, Independence Hall is a building that we know that we have to preserve. We have to preserve that building forever. But at the same time, when you look at the importance of that building, because of those two events that I just talked about, the establishment of our country and the development of our Constitution, it is also important that that building be made accessible to as many people as possible. So there's the front steps of Independence Hall. So you could see the barriers to getting into it. But on the rear of the building, for many, many years, there was a wooden ramp that staff people, including myself, because I began my career with the National Park Service in 1976 during the bicentennial, we had to haul that 45-pound wooden ramp out when it was requested to enable people with wheelchairs to be able to get into the back of Independence Hall. About 15 or 20 years ago, a new ramp, permanent, complying with the standards, was put in the back of that back of Independence Hall. And again, it's because focusing on the need to get everyone into that building was so important that the decision was made to put a permanent ramp onto that building. Over the years, I've been asked many times by many people, what supersedes what? Preservation laws and regulation or accessibility laws and regulations? And I always answer yes. It's truly a balance between the two. It's getting accessibility specialists and getting preservation specialists together to determine how best can that be achieved. And if we all do our jobs well, accessibility and preservation will both occur. So there's a few different things we need to consider. And I'm going to go back a little bit further than David, mainly because when we talk about legislation within the federal sector, it goes back to 1968 with the Architectural Barriers Act. And sometimes you almost have to follow the money when it comes to looking at what standards you do. you always use the most stringent standards, but sometimes the most stringent standards may be because you've accepted a federal grant. And going along with that federal grant says you have to follow at minimum, the federal standards. And then if state or local standards exceed that, well, then you also have to exceed that and follow everything that David had mentioned earlier in the presentation. So the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968 comes into play. If you've accepted or you are a federal entity or you've accepted federal money, at minimum, you may have to follow the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, along with the Americans with Disabilities Act that David talked about, 1990. The 2010 Standards for Accessible Design, and the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties. So I want to talk about the Secretary's Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties, because there's a few different things that we need to address. And as you can see, here's the definition of preservation. It's the act or process of applying measures necessary to sustain or protect the integrity of the materials that are used at that historic property. The work that goes on with preservation is focusing on ongoing maintenance, repair of historic materials to make sure that we are maintaining that building in a way that it is originally built. So we're looking at the original materials. We're not looking at new construction or new.
Ray, I don't know. Looks like you got muted, and I know I'm gonna have to Google this, but I don't know if you. I think you can hear me, but
I think that was me by mistake. Sorry about that.
So sorry about this, Ray. Hopefully you can hear me. I forget what the code is on your phone to unmute yourself. Hang on just a second here.
Sorry, we're getting some feedback. So I thought I didn't realize he was on the phone.
Okay, Ray, if you can hit *6.
Okay, I got it.
Okay, thanks. Very, very sorry.
Sorry about that, everybody.
That's quite all right. Okay. And what I was saying, I think when we got muted here, the possible exception is if you need to put in things like HVAC systems or electrical systems in many of our historic buildings. Here's an example of preservation. It's the Custom House in Salem Maritime National Historic Park in Salem, Massachusetts. And this is where it's a building that is preserved at the 1819 timeframe of when that building was built and put into use. Rehabilitation is a little bit different. Again, it's the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a building, repair, addition, or alterations in order to still maintain the architectural aspects of the building. Here's the Second Bank in Philadelphia at Independence National Historic Park. And again, we added, in order to make elements of it accessible, we added, but we did not change the original structure of the building in order to do that. We only added, we didn't take anything away, but we did add something to it. So you can alter or add, so long as you retain the building's historic character. Restoration is defined as accurately depicting the features or character, looking at the particular period of time that that building has been identified as its purpose or intended period of restoration. So you may take away different periods or take away features of a building that have been added or are not part of, excuse me, of that original period of time. You may also put back or reconstruct pieces that have been removed in bringing it back to that particular period of time that was identified. So again, you can still add in things like electrical, HVAC, or whatever is necessary in order to maintain or utilize that building as a public building, as an historic site. Here's the Eugene O'Neill National Historic Site in California. And this was restored to the 1937 to 1944 period of time. And we're looking at both the structure and the grounds. There's several families that lived in that property after Eugene O'Neill, but we wanted to bring it back, I see we being the National Park Service, wanted to bring it back to the period of time when Eugene O'Neill lived in the house. So here's an example of some of the features that were brought back as far as both the structure and the grounds to bring it back to the way it was in that 1937 to 1944 period of time. A reconstruction is actually new construction of a building that had no longer exists, building or a property that no longer exists. But it's necessary for the entity that owns the property to put that feature or that structure back. And with research, it's brought back to its original form, replicating its original appearance. This is not something that is done very frequently, in particular by the National Park Service. However, back during the bicentennial, there were several different sites, and here's an example, and it's Fort Stanwix's National Historic Site in Rome, New York, and they brought back a 1778 fort that was during that Revolutionary War or bicentennial or Revolutionary War period of time, and it was reconstructed at the time of the bicentennial. It's rarely done today. However, when it is a new construction, keep in mind, it is still new construction, even though it's a reconstruction. So you really do need to pay attention to the new standards in terms of making sure that accessibility is addressed through that process. Because again, it's no longer an existing structure. I want to touch a little bit on program access, because initially I mentioned that when we're looking at historic sites, we have to look at the, put some focus on the purpose or the reason why that structure was built. So what does it mean for historic sites? What are the program issues? What are the opportunities that people have to benefit? How do visitors participate in their experience at that particular building? So I want to use Mount Vernon as an example. So first we're looking at the mansion itself. How is the mansion a program? Well, it is preserved and it is interpreted, and we discuss the mansion with and to the public so they can understand the mansion as an historic site. So therefore, that is part of the program. So when you talk about what are the questions that you want to ask about a historic structure or an historic property, because again, I'll use Mount Vernon as an overall example. What are the opportunities? What do visitors do? How do they participate? So what you're looking at is the entire site. Here's an example of the site map, and you can get an idea of what all we're addressing. So I talked about the architecture. You're looking at the garden, the entire landscape, all the different outbuildings and how they're used. It's all preserved. It's all interpreted. They do some living history there. So there's a lot of interpretation and opportunities that all visitors have. So when we say, what are the opportunities? that comes down to what do we need to provide as far as accessibility is concerned, both physical and programmatic. When we look at the interior of the mansion, we're looking at the artifacts, the exhibits, and it's all of the aspects of it. So what else are we talking about when we talk about program access? George Washington and his family, and how they used that property is an important part of the story that visitors have the opportunity to benefit when they go to Mount Vernon. So you're looking at the programs in an inclusive opportunity for everyone at all times. I want to follow up with something that David talked about earlier, and that is looking at all of the opportunities that people with disabilities have. But one thing we want to focus on throughout the whole process, and I want you to keep this in mind in all of the decision making that you are involved with historic sites. People with disabilities are just like people without disabilities. They don't just come to an historic site by themselves. Sometimes they do. Sometimes people without disabilities do. But most people travel with family, moms, dads, children. They come as couples. They come with school groups, social groups. When an historic site is physically accessible, it means that those groups that I just mentioned don't have to separate and do things separate but different, even though there may be a programmatic alternative that may have been required because of accessibility issues. And we'll talk a little bit about those later. But keep in mind, you don't want to make decisions that require people have to separate from the people that they came with when it comes to coming to an historic site. So you want it to be all-inclusive with the same opportunities at the same time. And think of all the different types of historic sites that we talk about. Forts, historic homes, battlefields, so we're looking at properties, landscapes. We're looking at the maintaining and preserving so that we can interpret and provide opportunities for historic events, monuments. It's all of those things fall in, and many things that I didn't mention fall in under the different opportunities that we have to make decisions on how do we provide opportunities to the fullest extent possible in an inclusive manner. So there's a couple of primary points of accessibility when it comes to program accessibility, and this is taken directly out of both Section 504 of the Rehab Act and Title II of the ADA, and that is how do you gain, people with disabilities have to be able to gain the benefits of and participate in all of the programs and opportunities that are available to people without disabilities.
Hey, Ray, can I just have you pause for a moment? Oh, it looks like the slides are advancing now. There's been a couple of questions in the chat about the slides not advancing, and so I don't know if Michelle is, but it looks like now we've got some advancing, so.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I think we're good.
Okay. In the regulations, there are a couple of key aspects that I am going to touch on because they're really important to what is provided at historic sites, and therefore it has to become part of the decision process that we go through in making historic sites accessible. Effective communication is absolutely critical, and that is how do people, again, get the benefits of. For many, many years, effective communication was only addressed when it came to printed material or audio visuals. And then after the International Spy Museum discrimination case was settled, and the settlement agreement by the Department of Justice indicated that exhibits will fall in under effective communication. So everything that we do where exhibits, along with the historic sites, if that is a part of what is provided to people, we have to effectively communicate that to all people that have all different types of disabilities. When viewed in its entirety is another key point, and I'll show an example of that in a little while. Integrated settings, and then programmatic alternatives. let's talk about integrated setting. If you have an historic site with an elaborate front door, and this has come up numerous times over the years, we don't want to make the front entrance accessible. We've got this really elaborate front door. The kick plates on a wheelchair are going to they're going to scratch that front door, and therefore we're going to have the accessible entrance be the back door. Well, let's not make the decision solely on the basis of people with disabilities, but let's actually protect the front door. Cameras that are hanging on straps on people's shoulders, backpacks, purses, every other thing that can also damage an elaborate front door. So let's bring visitors to the front door, look at, interpret that door, and then make the rear entrance accessible to everyone so that it truly is protecting the front door. And that also includes access to people pushing strollers. So there's the integrated setting. Programmatic alternative. The Lincoln Home in Springfield, Illinois is a really good example of this. There's a disappearing lift that goes below the sidewalk, comes up onto the boardwalk, and that will get you into the first floor of the Lincoln Home. You get the feel of the Lincoln Home, you get the idea of the kind of furnishings, a little bit about the Lincoln and his family. And there's a staircase that gets you to the second floor. It is not practical to get people to the second floor using any type of lift or elevator. So this is an example where a programmatic alternative comes up, and that is a Ranger, and a photo album was used for many, many years, and it was replaced by a video. And we also use a tablet there that not only does it provide the visual aspect of what is on the second floor, it shows the furnishings that are up there. It also provides interpretation, and it has sign language as another means of communicating what is being effectively communicated to people without disabilities on the second floor. Sign language will provide information to people who are deaf while on the first floor. Now, you can put an alternative program in place for a temporary period of time while you're making a structure accessible, or it may also be put in on a more permanent period of time, like we have at the Lincoln Home. But you have to go back and periodically look at that at that programmatic alternative to make sure that it hasn't outdated itself because technology or methods of providing accessibility have not come into play. An example of this is Alcatraz in Golden Gate National Recreation Area in San Francisco, California. Here's the view of the route to the Sally Point. And at one point in the 1980s, they had a programmatic alternative. They had a computer interactive that let people know what going through the cell block was like. So it showed all aspects of it. The National Park Service did get a complaint in the late 1990s, and the complaint essentially said there are a lot of ways that the National Park Service can investigate to actually get people into the cell block. So the result of the complaint required the National Park Service to do some investigating. And they did find, here's an example of the tram that is used. This is the type of tram that was used to get people around the Olympic Village to the different venues at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. The tram cars that are pulled by the type of electric tractor that is used to pull airplanes away from terminals. So it was not going to have an impact on the historic site leading up to the cell block, but it'll pull people up the slope leading up to the Sally Port, and it gets you into the cell block. And some of the experiences that we have, there are people there that have audio accessibility available for people who have hearing loss using assistive listening systems. But one of the things that the program alternative, the computer interactive, did not enable people to experience, and that are the sounds, the feelings, and the emotions that happen at an historic site like Alcatraz. The term slammer, one of the reasons that is used, you can see the ranger here and that big lever that the ranger has. And he demonstrates this, he or she, with every visitor group that goes through Alcatraz. When that lever is pulled from one side to the other, all of the doors on all of the cells, on all 3 floors, the prisoners are told, get back in their cell. And then that lever is pulled, and all of those doors simultaneously are moved, and you hear a slam, and you feel the vibration of that building. And therefore, that's where the term slammer came from when they talk about a prison. So here's an example of a solitary cell, the sense of isolation. You can't get that feeling through an interactive. So it was really important that we make that building accessible and people go through and have that full experience. And again, that's part of the decision-making process. When you come up with a programmatic alternative, well, keep on looking and say, have they come up with something that will enable people to have an actual experience, again, together with their family and friends that they arrived with. Fort Sumter is an example of when viewed in its entirety. Here's the aerial view when viewed in its aerial view of the Fort Sumter. Here's a cannon battery and casemate. The first cannon is fully accessible. Anybody can go into it, walk around it. You can go get around it if you're a wheelchair user, tactically examine it if you feel the need, desire to do so. And the battery is made up of multiple cannons. As you can see, looking down the whole row of the cannons. That's what makes up that battery. However, only the first one has an accessible route to get to it. But you can look down and see cannon after cannon after cannon, which makes up the battery. Does every single cannon, considering that they're all the same, does every single cannon have to be accessible? No. When viewed in its entirety, making the first one accessible and viewing the battery, when viewed in its entirety, that is an accessible experience. Now, I want to talk about the adaptive use of historic structures. Many historic structures are used for a lot of different purposes. And again, I want to go back to the use and the decision-making process, the use of different historic structures. Hang on one second, I've got a minor technical issue here. Okay, so we use a lot of historic sites for visitor centers, museums, and other such things. When we make those types of decisions, that may require us to make some decisions that we wouldn't ordinarily make if the building were not going to be used as a visitor center. Think of the full function of a visitor center. A visitor center has restrooms, basic orientations. It's the place where you may get accommodations, gift shops, bookstores, audiovisuals may be provided there, such as orientation films. Here's an example of at Hot Springs National Park in Arkansas, the Fordyce Bathhouse. It was determined that in Bathhouse Row, several of the other buildings may be restored, but the Fordyce Bathhouse would become the visitor center. So when you look at the exterior, you can see the steps, and a ramp was added to the front of the building to get individuals that could not use the steps rather, up into the building. And there's the interior used as a visitor center. Cuyahoga Valley in Ohio is another site where an historic building is used as a visitor center. So therefore, the decision is made that in order to use that building as a visitor center, we will make the decision to add things like ramps, maybe modify or alter a doorway. Again, you also have to make a lot of decisions within the interior. Some buildings may have had restrooms, or restrooms may have been added later. And those restrooms have to be accessible, meeting accessibility standards. Here's an example, another one of a visitor center, and this is Fort Larned National Historic Site. Again, putting ramps on both ends of this was a fort that was built in 1859 to 1878, a frontier fort. It's the aerial view, and then the visitor center. It had restrooms, gift shop, exhibits, orientation exhibits, information on accessibility for the rest of the site. And the entrance is wheelchair accessible with a power door, and you've got the ramps to get up on and off the porch at both ends. Again, using historic sites for museum buildings. Here's another example, and this is Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Park in Alabama. The historic hangar was used as a museum. It has exhibits, and it also has orientation information that's also provided. But we've got to make sure that the building itself is accessible, because the exhibits there are telling the story in using many different aspects of what is necessary to understand the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. So even though we have chosen to restore some of the hangars, this one in particular, used as a museum, was made accessible, physically accessible, enabling all people to experience the museum. Also, regulations, both Section 504 and the ADA, do prohibit the use of adding programs into inaccessible areas, unless, as David pointed out, that you also put an alternative program that is also accessible, that provides equity to people with disabilities in an accessible area. Here's an example of Fort Point National Historic Site in San Francisco. It is a fort that has 3 levels. Many forts have upper levels, and because we don't always have the plans, we don't always have the historic information or the historic furnishings to make the upper floors accessible, oftentimes it's a lot of unused space. And for many years, those unused spaces had exhibits put in there. You might have other exhibits that relate to that period of time, or the use of that historic fort or the historic building, if it happens not to be a fort. And they were put into those inaccessible spaces. But now, because of the regulations, you can't put other programs into inaccessible spaces.
Hey, Ray, can I interrupt you for a second?
Certainly.
The next slides that I have in the presentation, I stopped at Cuyahoga Valley. I don't have anything for Tuskegee or Fort Point. The next slides that I have are for Martin Luther King.
Okay. Not sure why they're not there. But anyway, I'm going to, we're about to go to Martin Luther King. Thank you for letting me know that. Okay, another area I'm just going to mention, and that is an awful lot of historic structures are also used for administrative purposes. They may be used for curatorial facilities or staffing or headquarters offices or whatever. Under those circumstances, people with disabilities still have to be able to, number one, be employed, and the fact that it is an historic building that may not be accessible is not a reason not to employ an individual. It may be that that particular work site, we find an alternative place for that, or only make the first floor accessible, or in where we may have things like library facilities or curatorial facilities that may be occasionally opened for public use for research purposes. We may have to provide whatever is in the library or the curatorial space may have to be brought to a first floor area. Okay, now I want to move on to Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is part of the Martin Luther King Historic Site in Atlanta, Georgia. So you can see that the exterior of the church is not an accessible facility. Here's the auditorium, the fellowship hall that is on the first floor. So this particular, we want to make the site as accessible as possible. So the fellowship hall is made accessible. You can access it from the outside to the first floor, and then a lift was put in to get you from that floor up to the sanctuary of the second floor, which is actually the first floor of the church itself. The first time this lift was used was for a celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday, and they were going to have an event within the sanctuary of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. The superintendent of the park went out to meet and escort Andrew Young as a guest for that special event. And Andrew Young said to the superintendent that he no longer has the ability to walk up the stairs. He was quite old at the time, and he said he does not think that he'll be able to participate in the celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday. The superintendent said, "Please come with me. We'll get you to the upper floor." She took him down the ramp to get to the fellowship hall and up the lift. So he was the first one to use the lift to the sanctuary. And that particular accessible feature was actually submitted and received an accessibility award by the National Park Service. And when the superintendent was presenting the information about how they made this site accessible, and she was talking about her experience with Andrew Young, when he stepped off the lift, she looked at him and she said tears were running down his face. And he turned to her and he said he never thought that he'd ever be in that historic structure again. And it was a place where he saw Martin Luther King many times and heard him preach sermons at that sanctuary. And it was so meaningful to him as an individual who got a chance to use that lift. So we talked about using lifts. This is one that I always recommend, that if you can't make an historic site accessible any other way, then go towards a lift. But they're not the first option. First of all, lifts have a tendency to break down a little bit more often than an elevator, or obviously, if a ramp is used, it's not going to break down. Quite frequently, and Fort Sumter's a really good example of that. Not only did this one break down, but they can't even get parts anymore to get it fixed. So the National Park Service is in the process now of, because it has been broken down for several months. They're in the process of working with facility managers along with historic preservation specialists to try to figure out a more permanent ramp system if that's going to be possible. There's an example of the lift that gets you to the battlements. Here's another one, another lift, and this is a lift at John Muir's home. And this is one where, again, it's rather loud, and many of the lifts are loud. We talk about, it's also not the most attractive lift in the world. In working with preservation specialists, we talk about how important it is to maintain the visual characteristic of a site. And I'm not sure that we did a very good job here in maintaining the visual characteristics of a site when we're using this type of a lift. I wanted to talk a little bit about Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. A decision was made to make the Jefferson Memorial accessible. So in the process, here's a look of the Jefferson Memorial with the cherry blossoms out. The front of the memorial and a shot from the side. Now keep in mind what the front of the memorial looked like. Steps is how they are, and two different possible approaches with a ramp on the side. One of those is a little bit more discreet, more towards the back. One of those is a little bit larger, bigger, and more visible towards the front. When we were going through the planning process on how, when I'm saying we being the group of individuals that were managers of the site, historic preservation people, accessibility specialists, and so on, and when we were going through the discussion on the planning process, the historic preservation specialist talked about the purpose of the original design of the Jefferson Memorial, and that was to have a grand staircase and the grand approach that everyone would have as they rose to the rotunda level where the statue of Thomas Jefferson is placed. So the suggestion was, shouldn't people with disabilities, and if we put this ramp in, it may be there for many, many years, possibly centuries going forward. Shouldn't people with disabilities or anyone who chooses to or is not able to climb the stairs also have the experience of a grand entry, even if they can't use those stairs? So that was the decision that we went in. So as you're going through the process, there's a few things I want you to keep in mind. You always add before you attempt to remove things in order to make something accessible. You add a ramp. You can always take it away if things change in the future. If you have to remove, you do your best to try and make any processes reversible. Again, you never know what's in the future. Something better can come along in the future. You want to make sure that any changes that you make are visually compatible. Now, I use that term specifically, visually compatible. I did not say matching, because people should know that we have added a feature and it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. We've added a compatible feature, but we want people to realize that's not part of the original building. It was added in order to provide accessibility. But you want to do everything that's possible to get an actual experience for all people together the way they came there, a family, a school group, whatever it might be. People with disabilities, along with, again, who they came with, have to get a feel for the character that once lived in that historic structure, or for the particular event, such as what it's like to be in the assembly room of Independence Hall and see the 13 desks and the president's desk in the assembly room of Independence Hall, the place, what happened on that battlefield, or whatever it might be. So keep in mind how people visit it, and you want to make sure that you're keeping everyone together where it's possible. Historic preservation is inconsistent from one area to another. And we've got to make sure that we're looking at all of the different examples on how we may have been able to make something accessible in one area and possibly duplicate or replicate that approach in another area where it may be feasible. And not only bring accessibility specialists together with preservation specialists, and there was a long period of time, I've been doing this since the 1970s, where I was grateful to even be able to be in the discussion. And nowadays, we're all at the table together. But not only is it people that are accessibility specialists along with preservation specialists, but you want to bring, if possible, bring people with disabilities into the discussion. Many times while people with disabilities have been on vacation, traveling around, they may have experienced a solution to a problem that has not been thought of at that particular site. And they might say, well, at such and such a place, I experienced this and it worked. So having that type of input could be very beneficial. So here's the Organic Act that established the National Park Service in 1916. The key thing that I want to talk about of the Organic Act is this one bolded part that talks about the fact that we're providing for the enjoyment in such manner or means that will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. It doesn't say future generations except people with disabilities. It's future generations. And that is a key component of that particular piece of legislation that established the National Park Service. And it says that we'll leave them unimpaired. Well, that's always the goal, to have the least impact while we're providing the greatest level of accessibility. But when you think about the term unimpaired, and you think about the parking lots that have been added to historic sites, the roads to accommodate 20th and 21st century visitors, the HVAC systems that have been put in, protection, security, sprinkler systems that have been added. We sometimes have to, in order to preserve, sometimes we do have to impair. In order to make things accommodating to our 20th and 21st century visitors, sometimes we do have to make some changes, such as adding a parking lot or roads, adding a visitor center to a property to accommodate hundreds of thousands of visitors to an historic site that only at one time accommodated a family. So keep in mind, when we look at that term, unimpaired for future generations, when we do our job well, and we do make an accommodation for accessibility, but we do it in a really good way, making that balance between historic preservation and accessibility, that will be there not only in 2021, but it'll be there in 30 and 40, 21, 100, 200 years from now. We want to make sure that we've done our job well. And what has occurred is that level of accessibility and those examples, those accommodations become part of the preservation history. So we talk about the changes and impact that we have in order to preserve and repair. We want to make sure that accessibility is also a part of that accommodation and a part of that history. So we're truly balancing it and becoming part of the history. There's always possibilities of making things accessible in ways that we never imagined, such as, beam me up, Scotty. Here's Mesa Verde National Historic Park. Okay, is there any questions that have come in the chat? Todd, if you could read some of those, I'll do my best in the next few minutes to address those.
Yeah, I think there's one in particular, and then I kind of have one too, but I think many of us looking forward to beaming up on some of these sites. Mesa Verde is a really important place for me, and I'd love for people to see it in all of its all of its forms. Okay, so I don't know if it's Colin or Colin, but I think this is a really interesting question. It says, if a historic site originally had a lift installed during the 1960s, is it possible to rehabilitate the lift to a point the public could use it safely? And are there any good alternatives for increasing access to upper floors? I kind of love the idea of some of these accessibility features actually being part of potential periods of significance in the National Register.
Thank you, and that's an excellent question. We actually have in many historic buildings, both Park Service and non-Park Service historic structures, where an historic, as a matter of fact, that Fordyce bathhouse at Hot Springs, Arkansas, that had a elevator that did go up to an upper floor. It was gutted, and a new elevator was put in its place, when that was made into a visitor center. Now, if you go to the home of Franklin Roosevelt, there is an elevator. It's an historic elevator. Franklin Roosevelt himself pulled himself up to the upper floor because the elevator rose and descended by a pulley type rope system. That one will never be changed and made into an accessible elevator because of the fact that it is historic and is important, very important to the telling of the story of Franklin Roosevelt as a man with a disability who used a wheelchair and used that elevator in a different way. But yes, you can use an existing elevator shaft, rehabilitate it, and make it accessible to people with disabilities today. There are also lifts that sometimes can be I typically don't like to bring up particular vendors, but a Garaventa lift is a stair lift type of lift that goes over top of stairs that can bring you to the upper floor of an historic building, and it may have limited impact on the historic structure. Sometimes you can take a section of a building that may exist onto an historic structure. It may not be an historic part of that building, but it may not have been removed. And that part of the building may be able to have an elevator put in. So you can still add an elevator into a non-historic part of the building. We've got a few different examples in the Park Service where a building next door to an historic building was purchased or was part of the historic structures that came with that, the enabling legislation with that particular part. The William Johnson House in Natchez, Mississippi, the house next to it is not historic. So they put an elevator in there and created an entryway through the wall of the upper floor. It did have some historic or some impact, but it did not have significant impact to the most historic aspects of that building. The Peterson House in Washington, D.C., the home where Abraham Lincoln was taken after he was shot in Ford's Theater. It was across the street from Ford's Theater. The bedroom where he was placed until he died the following morning was made accessible using the same method that I just talked about. They made the building next door accessible and broke through the wall of the Peterson House in order to enable people to experience that very, very important room where Abraham Lincoln died on April 15th, 1865. So there's just a couple examples. When you really think about accessibility and historic sites, it does take some creativity. It takes bringing people who know accessibility, people who have experienced accessible features, and preservation specialists together. And rather than look for the ways on why we can't do it, look for the ways on how we can do it and how we can do it well, minimizing impact while increasing accessibility. And we'll get there. We've got a lot of examples that show how we've done it.
Thanks, Ray. We've got one more question here. We're at a minute to go, but I think that we can try to squeeze this one in. And so it's this is from Kim. She says, something we struggle with is adding the infrastructure to provide building access. For example, an accessible entrance at a historic house museum would require building a new sidewalk in front of, or maybe the back of, the house. The sidewalk is not very intrusive, but is adding something new that could disrupt the cultural landscape of the property. How can we approach the problem? And I think this is that sort of that planning thing to it. You know, getting someone inside the building, then to be confronted by another barrier is, you know, something to think about with the planning. But in this case, they're asking about sort of the landscape sort of feature and how a sidewalk, considerations with that.
Sometimes using the right, and when I talked about using materials that are compatible, you don't want to put in a walkway that exactly duplicates other walking surfaces throughout that site, but you may add in a walkway that lets the public know we've created that to enable accessibility. We've made it compatible. So we didn't add in blacktop to some place where you may have bricks all around that is the walking surface, but we've created something that is compatible. It lets the public know that it was added, but it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. It at least blends in with that environment. Sometimes you can even use materials such as there are different types of materials, graded concrete that can enable grass to grow up. This was also used at the Melrose Mansion in Mississippi. From a distance, the grass grows up between the spaces in the graded concrete. So from a distance, you can't see the concrete, but when you get up close, you have a hardened surface to walk over or roll over.
Great. Okay, so we're just 1 minute over.